Hey, everybody. It is Richard Harris and Scott Leese with another fun episode of the Surf and Sales podcast. This one's going to be interesting for sure. Got to go through some of our new stuff, but eventually we will, in just a minute, introduce our guests. And yes, it's guests. I think, Scott, it's the first time we've had other podcast people and where they actually co-host their own podcast. So we'll leave that mystery there. But well, as I go through the standards of what we got to do these days, we want to give a shout out to the HubSpot Podcast Network. We appreciate all that they're doing to help the sales community. We appreciate what they've done to add us to the network. It's almost funny. I want to call them our co-host. Our co-hosts for this episode are also part of the HubSpot Podcast Network. However, before we get to them, I want to just give a shout out to our good friend Jason Bay, who we've known for a while. He's put on some great conferences. He has an amazing podcast also where he brings on sales leaders and sales experts and even reps to talk about actionable tips and strategies. So if you haven't checked out Jason Bay's podcast, which I think he's done topics with call reluctance, he's done procrastination, he's done things on other hacks and tricks into the mindset space. And so he's had a lot of good friends on that we know. His podcast is called Outbound Squad. So please check out Jason Bay, Outbound Squad. I'm sure you can find it in, all 12,000 places. You can find HubSpot, or you can find podcasts as well as HubSpot in 12,000 places. And again, thanks to HubSpot and the podcast network. Now, let me introduce Leanne and AL Elliott. People say that Scott and Richard sound like an old married couple. These folks are a married couple. I don't know that they're old, but they are a married couple who host their own podcast, also part of the HubSpot Podcast Network, called Truth, Lies, and Workplace Culture. It is Leanne and AL Elliott. Welcome to the show. Appreciate y'all coming on board.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. Yeah, we're really excited about this.
Yeah, there's so many firsts in this one. One, another podcast host where they're actually co-hosts. One, an actual married couple, as opposed to Richard and Scott, who are not married, just sound married. And then what's really cool is that Leanne is and correct me if I'm wrong, a business psychologist who really understands the psychology of building and running organizations and teams and sales teams in particular. Al is the business brain behind it all, and he says he likes to geek out on all the podcast technology and stuff. So he brings that side together. So thank you. Longest 2-minute intro I think I've ever done. Well, let's get to it. So first question, how long have y'all had your podcast?
We've got 2 podcasts.
Okay.
That was the question, how long we had the podcast?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got 2 podcasts. We started a travel one back in about 2017 because we travel full time. So we just spend 6 months in any one place and then just up sticks and off, go and find somewhere else.
Scott, they're living the dream.
Wow. Yeah. I just want to talk about that the rest of the time.
we can do that if you want. Yeah.
We can. So we started that. We'd got to about 40 countries in 9 years or something, or 8 years, 40 countries, about 150 Airbnbs. And we thought we need to start talking about this. So we basically just got a couple of microphones, sat there, talked, stuck it on Podbean, and it kind of took off a little bit. It was doing 20,000 downloads in the previous year, which we didn't do any promotion. So we're starting to get some organic reach with that. And then when we started our consultancy, which is around Leanne's expertise of organizational psychology, we just said, what do we know? We know the truth. We know the podcast world. So we started the Truth, Lies, and Workplace podcast. I should be better at saying that. And when was that?
So Truth and Lies was last summer, maybe July time. And we got picked up by HubSpot in October.
Yeah.
That's really cool. So what made you want to do that one? What made you go Truth, Lies, and Workplace Culture, which I love? One, I love the title, so good. I love the fact that it's about workplace culture. What made you decide that was the topic you wanted to focus on?
I think for our consultancy and kind of what we do, workplace culture encompasses everything. Because yes, we cover talent acquisition, we cover leadership, we cover engagement, we cover well-being, but it all kind of comes under the umbrella of workplace culture. I think as well, when you're talking to business leaders now, our typical customers are usually owner-led businesses around about 50 people, don't typically have much background in people. They've usually built their business through an expertise like sales or marketing or digital. Whereas workplace culture is a term they understand, and they kind of understand what it means. And when we were kind of meeting new clients, that usually what they'd come to us with is, I need help with my culture. And a bit digging, we'd realize actually need help with engagement or well-being or leadership. But in terms of the actual title, that was no mistake.
You might appreciate this. So there's a book called The 4-Hour Work Week by, and I've forgotten his name, bald head, did the 4-hour, it'll come to me.
Wasn't me, but I do have a bald head. So.
No, he wasn't you. And basically he got this idea that for the book was originally called Drug Dealing and Other Ways to Make Money or something, and his publisher wouldn't allow him to do it. So he said, well, ran some Google ads to find out what would be the best best book title. So we did the same. So we started off Pride in Your People as the podcast, and then I ran about 4 Google ads for about a week, display ads, and just saw which one got the most clicks. And Truth, Lies, and Workplace Culture got the most clicks consistently, even when I started taking the losers out. So it ended up that was clearly what the audience had told us was the perfect title. And you're not the first person to say that. So I wish I could say, it came to me while I was sitting on a mountaintop, cross-legged, just manifesting my podcast, but it didn't.
But no, it came over a very long list, over maybe too many beers in the sun and then some Google ads.
Yeah.
Well, it's better than saying ChatGPT told me.
Well, ChatGPT wasn't around then. Well, I'm sure it was, but it wasn't available to the public. But we did actually go through all the top 100 podcasts, and I did put them all in a spreadsheet, the titles, to try and see a theme, and some of them which were like this and this seemed to do quite well. So that gave us the kickoff. But
that's a more scientific approach than I've taken to virtually anything in my life, Richard.
Right.
Well, how did you go with your title?
Well, we were already running the Surf and Sales Summit, the events.
Right.
And so it was Richard's idea to spin off a podcast. And he was, I don't know if he had any names, but he was like, we have to think of a name. And I said, we already have a brand of Surf and Sales. Why don't we just call it the Surf and Sales Podcast rather than trying to recreate, a new brand from scratch? And so that was like a 2-minute conversation.
Yeah, that was it.
That was it.
Yeah. And you can already tell, wow, they haven't thought much more about it since then. 4 years.
That's right.
So,
I want to ask about the differences in business culture from one part of the world to the next. You're running a consulting business, for example. I'm sure the way that you prospect people in EMEA is different than North America or different than APAC, and the way that you create culture in these different geographies is a little bit different. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the geographic differences in business culture and how to approach and work with people.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it comes down to, and I was actually having this conversation with Sonia Thompson from Inclusion Marketing, who's also on the network, and we were kind of saying that if we think about the definition of culture, there's many. We can never agree, but the definition that we both really like is culture is defined by the worst behaviors tolerated. In that, it doesn't matter how much positive things you try and do, and supportive things and productive things and collaborative things, if you have pockets of toxicity within your business where these more disrespectful behaviors live. So when you think about it in terms of behaviors, that's where we can start to see cultural differences slightly in terms of what's acceptable in terms of a disrespectful behavior versus a more respectful behavior. So for example, I think we were joking before we start pressing record, in the UK, we swear a lot, shit and all the others are just part of our day-to-day language. I don't know how many I can say.
I was wondering where you're going to go with that. How far up the tree?
I'll leave it with that. Whereas, there's going to be some workplaces, some people, whether it be demographics or cultures or ethnicities, that will find profanity offensive. So I think it kind of comes down to, whereas each culture and each behavior can be slightly different and be informed by the norms and customs of and the culture of the country that you're in, the actual kind of methodology to get to what those acceptable behaviors are is actually a similar process. And that comes down to conversation. It comes down to speaking to your employees, what behaviors are acceptable, what aren't, what behaviors reflect our values, what behaviors reflect the way we want to speak to each other, to our customers. And I think regardless of whether, you want to be in a male-dominated environment where banter and swearing is just how we communicate, or if actually you're in a much more more sensitive work environment in terms of how we communicate with each other, how we request work or request collaborations. That kind of doesn't matter. It's more about having the agreement collectively and upfront, and then policing that in a way that if behaviors start to drift into something that isn't acceptable or is disrespectful, that's not tolerated, and that's nipped in the bud.
I want to go back to one thing. I want you to repeat what you said. Culture is defined by the worst behavior. Say that again. I thought that was really eloquent.
Culture is
It reminds me
defined
of Scott, by the way. Like that's how he thinks about stuff. So
right. Perfect. Yeah. So it's actually a psychologist called John Amici. So he's British. Actually played in the NBA though.
He
fun
played
fact.
for the Orlando Magic.
Ah, you know John Amici. Excellent. He's an amazing psychologist and very influential globally, but especially in the UK. And his definition is behavior. Culture is defined as the worst behaviors tolerated.
that's really good. Scott, do you see it that way? Like that sounds
Yeah.
like something you would say.
Yeah, I'm not that smart though. I wouldn't say it that way. I would have flubbed it somewhere along the line. But yeah, I'm impressed that that somebody like John, who had gone through all the things that he's gone through. If you know about his life, he's gone through quite a lot and done a lot of things that are very brave and challenging, that not, somebody like myself hasn't gone through. And so he's coming from experience, I imagine, when he says that, being a part of different organizations and, being somebody that can be part of the protective element of creating a culture and be somebody who had the opportunity to be a victim and on the other side of something that could have gone wrong. So it's a very cool quote from him. I want to know about the number one lie about business culture that everybody believes is true.
Ooh.
I'm going to start with a baby lie, and that is that letting people go home an hour early on Friday or having pizzas for lunch on Friday makes a great culture. And yes, perhaps 15 years ago when no one was doing it, then that would be a thing. But now it's so transparent that if you're working people literally like 8 till 8 p.m. at night, they have to answer emails at the weekend, and all you do is throw $100 at getting 10 pizzas in on a Friday afternoon. People know that that's bullshit. It's just, we'll throw a little something at them and show we appreciate them.
Yeah.
Have you got another one?
No, I think that's a really good one, actually. Like you say, yeah, ping pong tables in the break room, that's going to mean we have a fun culture, and there's so much more that goes into it than that. I think the other lie is maybe that I guess maybe sometimes I hear culture kind of being defined from the top down. And I think that is true. But as I said, I think unless that's infiltrated into every part of your business in terms of operations, in terms of process, in terms of how you hire people, how you engage people, how you manage people, then culture is going to be created further down. Culture exists whether you intend for it to exist or not. So saying, well, I'm the leader and these are my values and this is the culture we have, probably not.
I think that works up into a certain size and scale of your organization, and then you lose immediate control of it. And then it has to be emulated by other people who are doing some of the roles and functions that you might have been doing when there was just like a 5-person business, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's that famous this research that shows that when you get to more than 70 people in an organization, village, whatever, then they split off into different sort of villages or teams. And 70, I think 72 is the number. Is in one of the Tom Peters books. That's going back a bit. Is one of the Tom Peters books. He talks about 72 is the magic number where you will start to split into different tribes. And then what you're saying there is you've got 2 potentially different cultures in different tribes. So it's even more difficult to manage that culture. And it's okay to have microcultures, isn't it? But overall, as you said, that definition of the worst behavior that you tolerate is still just rings true. And I think the other one final lie, which is in your world, I think, because I've done door-to-door sales, I've done phone sales, I've done inbound, outbound back in my youth. And I think one of the biggest lies is that sales cultures are all about, they're like boiler room film, and they're just like, you've just got to don't pitch the bitch, ring, and what's that phrase they say? Just keep ringing, and you ring and
Smile and dial.
That's the one I'm thinking of. And there's so many different ways these days where sales cultures are just great places to be, where everyone celebrates the other wins and stuff. And I think that some people look at sales as a way of, this is what I'm going to have to just be one of those pictures every single day. And I don't think that is true in a lot of new organizations.
Yeah, I agree. I have so many questions. I have questions around microcultures. How do you redefine a culture? Sales cultures versus other teams. Like I'm trying to figure out where to go with it. I think my next question is, you think you built a culture, right? And aside from contacting you, which everybody should go after to Leanne and AL and get their help. How do you redefine it? Like, how do you even start, right? Which is different than how do I do it if I'm a startup and I've only got 10 employees, right? Like, is there a way to sort of give some tips and ideas to people of like, okay, if you're at this phase, this is it. If you're at this phase, this is it. And then I have a follow-up question, which is, as I interview, how do I figure out what my new company's culture is? So, but I first want to sort of start with the other part. Like, where do you start?
So where do you start? That's it. Yeah, it is probably the most frequently asked question that we get. Where do you start? And I think there's a couple of things to kind of frame the answer, and kind of alluding to what we've already spoken about. They will get to a point as a leader, you're probably not going to have a very accurate idea of what your culture actually looks like in kind of lived every today experiences. So we're going to need to do a bit of a deep dive assessment into that. And I think secondly, recognizing that culture is a living, breathing, evolving thing, and it can feel natural to want to protect that culture as you grow. But it also needs to evolve. The culture that got you where you are is probably not going to be the culture that gets you to where you want to be in terms of growth and aspirations 5-10 years down the line. So I think in terms of starting places, and again, it was actually John Amici that said this, that was, the most powerful thing that you can do to understand how to get to where you want to be is understand where you are right now. And that's where it comes down to employee insight surveys, and they're not sexy. It really doesn't sound very sexy to go, do you know what we need to do? We need to run a survey and ask all your people lots of questions about how they feel and think about work. But that's what we do.
But do the employees, like, I feel like people do that. And, maybe I'm a Gen Xer and I'm like, oh, fucking in survey. Are they really going to tell the truth? Are they really going to share?
Do you tell the truth in those surveys, Richard?
I think most people probably give 80%. Right? Like, it's, in my consulting world, Scott, I'll tell the truth. When I was an employee, I get nervous about, well, is this going to put me on someone's radar because I'm the whiner or the complainer, right? I hate this person, or my boss talks to me. Like, I don't think that stuff, I think people are reserved about that part. So that's why I was asking, are people truthful?
I think there's 3 clever ways that Leanne's devised to overcome this.
That's pressure. There's a 3. I think a 2. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think particularly if you are experiencing aspects of toxicity within your culture, then you're not going to have what's called that psychological safety there. And that's what people need to feel able to be honest and open about how they're feeling about things without this fear of negative consequence. The way that we approach it is assuming that is the case, assuming that this environment has not been set up from the beginning to accommodate this very open and very candid feedback. So the survey that we run, for one, is third party. We're external to the organization. 2, is completely confidential. We don't ask for anyone's name or email address or identifying factors. If people, largely it's quantitative data, so we're not collecting any kind of specific details of people and their jobs. Where we do have those comment sections, they're all completely redacted to protect somebody's identity. That can be from somebody calling out their manager who they think is shit to, oh, I wish I could finish work early on a Friday because it would be nice to spend time with my 2 kids. Any kind of information that can identify a person, we remove. And then all of that data is then presented completely confidentially to the leadership team. There's no identifying factors. And then what we can also do within the tool that we've developed is it's a predictive model of workplace culture and engagement. So the science of it is we know that if things like peer support are really high in an organization, we should see similar feelings and behaviors reflected, things like belonging, things like organizational commitment, things like discretionary effort, extra role effort. We should be able to see that pattern follow through. If we have a high level of dishonesty in those questions coming in, those patterns aren't going to follow through. So it's almost like a bit of a built-in lie detector that we can kind of say, well, actually, this doesn't make sense in terms of the science. There might be an element here of dishonesty or not being completely transparent. And then the third thing we do with those insights is then actually follow it up with one-to-one interviews with staff to kind of run through the results, run through what it means to them, and try and get some more kind of context-based examples of what's actually going on. And again, all completely confidential. We never share the transcript of those interviews. We just share the high-level collective feedback point.
And I assume you tell people that, like, hey, you know, if you were to put something like this in, we would pull that. So that's how you start to build that trust. So before they get the survey, they understand, like, put what you want, but we know to pull these kinds of things and all that stuff.
Exactly. And it is that education session as well. In terms of the leadership team, understanding that this is the deal. We're not going to point people out. We're not going to tell you anything like that. Giving that reassurance to the staff. And also making the point that I'm a psychologist. I am bound by an organization of ethics. If I break this, you can report me and I'm struck off. So it's not just, you know, we can't just assume that you've got the trust here. Is literally my profession and reputation on the line if I don't follow through on this promise of confidentiality.
This is so funny. I work for Scott, and sorry, Scott, and I'll let you jump in, is Scott, it feels like they took your brain and they made a product out of it. Like, I've watched you do these things, seriously, like in a complimentary way. I've seen you do this and been a part of that. And you're very conscious about culture and the confidentiality and building that and that safe trust stuff. So it's
well, it sounds like I actually learned something when I got my psychology degree.
Yeah, so it does. So
I think just one last addendum to that is that there are a lot of surveys out there, varying from SurveyMonkey, where you create your own engagement survey, through to stuff like Office Vibe and Qualtrics, which are good products, but they are algorithmically based. So people will basically answer it, and then the algorithm will present you with a lovely report showing you the results. There's no one like Leanne in between that. There's no survey out there that does any kind of this kind of thing that has that buffer of someone who Leanne says is bound by ethics, who's going to sit there and look at the results before they get presented to management. So that's like you said there, and you said, Scott, it just stops that identifiable data from leaking back to management, so they can immediately go, well, that's Sandra, clearly, because she's been talking about a dog.
The trouble, one piece of trouble though, could be if the trust between employer and employee is broken enough. I don't think people will believe Leanne. I've felt that before. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, this person has like their professional reputation online. Sure, they're not going to report back to you. Only if the culture is broken, and so broken before somebody like that comes in. How do you get over that hump? Have you had to deal with that before, where you're like, oh my God, these people don't trust a lick of what I'm saying?
I have had scenarios where people are apprehensive. And again, it's kind of come down to that, the preparation we do before we launch the survey. So we know that we need to have the buy-in, not only of the senior leadership team or the business owner, but the board. If we don't have their buy-in to follow this process, it's fucked from the start. There's no point. Secondly, it's kind of a case of sharing the facts, sharing how we approach it, sharing our methodology, reassuring them around kind of the data protection that we use in-house, and how we'll translate that with the organization and their data. And thirdly, I guess it comes down to a case of this transparency. And we always say to people that leaders, one, don't gather these insights if you don't intend doing anything about it, because you're going to make this worse. You're going to, even though the culture is as bad as it can be, you can still go lower by asking people to help us out and then do nothing about it. And secondly, as an employee, this is the moment. this is a moment where things could change, but we need your help to do this. And if you're completely out and you're not interested, that's your choice, but nothing will change. And I guess at that point, it's then, well, they'll probably disengage to the point where they're going to leave.
Yeah,
anyway.
That was what I was wondering.
yeah, that's
Like,
probably true. Yeah.
you know, if it's that bad, those people might be out the door. You know, and which is fair, right? Like that's a reasonable place. If I'm interviewing, right? If I'm and particularly in sales, let's focus on the sales side. How do I know? How can I determine culture? You know, to see if because you know, I can't tell you, and I'm sure you've heard it too. Oh, they promised me all this and they said it was this way. And it's happened to me. Like, oh yeah, you have total control over your budget. Oh yeah, you can't spend $25, not kidding, without like it really happened without, I couldn't buy HubSpot email opener 10 years ago without getting approval for 3 people. Like, you know, how do you define, how do I as an individual, if I'm interviewing at a company, try to figure out what the culture really is like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think especially now as well, where that power shift has happened and employees are asking this question, particularly the back end of 2022 when it was such a competitive market, at least in Europe. I think there are things that you can always dive into, even in terms of how what's been shared with you in terms of the job description, in terms of the benefits, in terms of the values that we hold here. And I think it's really kind of scrutinizing as much as you can at interview stage, probably more able later on in the stages, is actually saying, you know, you say that, you know, you have control over budget, and you say that that's because it reinforces your value of being autonomous and bold. And, you know, can you give me an example of how this actually works in practice, and maybe an example of where you're experiencing some troubles in relating this down to the front line? I think as well, it's maybe even talking to, you know, great organizations, particularly sales organizations, will also, as part of their recruitment process, have kind of opportunities where you get to meet the rest of the team and the rest of the peers. And I think it's often asking those people are probably going to tell you a lot more honestly about how it actually looks on the front line. But I think for me, any red flag, and this is, and millennials and Gen Z are all over this already, we hate incongruence. Anything that doesn't match what we're told with how it looks, red flag. So I think even if you might not be able to, in an interview situation, nudge it down to the fact that you'll know how you can actually spend your sales budget, but there's even just the slightest thing that seems out of sync. For example, we pride ourselves on having excellent communication, and you know, you're promised you're going to hear back about the next round in 2 days, but you don't hear back for 4. Well, that's a flag. And I think it's even just little things like that that can maybe start to pick out, do you do what you say?
I think if I was interviewing for a sales company, the first thing I'd do would be inquire about the product they're selling before I even go to interview, and just see how I'm treated as a customer or a prospect. And that's probably going to tell us a lot about how they treat people. Because if you're not getting treated well there, well, it doesn't seem like you're going to get treated well if you're on the other end of the phone, does it?
I never thought about that. That's so simple and smart. Like that's, what kind of research should I do? Oh, I sat in on your sales call. I had someone pitch me. How many sales leaders would be like, oh shit. Scott, what do you, and you hear this question, right? Because again, you have the psychology degree and you think about this stuff differently. What's your opinion of when you advise someone? Because I know you advise a lot of people too. How do you advise them to look for good culture? Because I think it's important.
I have not told people to go through the buying process. That's a really good idea. I have advised people to talk to current customers, talk to past customers, talk to current employees, talk to past employees, rather than just take the word of the one person that you're talking to about what the culture is like. I've also tried to encourage people to be really clear about what they want and what they don't want, or what would feel uncomfortable for them. I'm actually somebody who believes that a person's own self-awareness is really critical to finding a good cultural fit for themselves. Like, I know, for example, that I'm a super impatient person. So a bad culture for me would be trying to work at a big, huge company where it takes 11 signatures to change the water cooler. Like, I can't do that. There's no way. Right. So that company's culture might not be bad. It just might be a bad fit for me. And I don't think people have defined that necessarily enough for themselves. So they unwittingly put themselves in a position that will cause them harm. So I've tried to encourage that, define it for yourself. What exactly are you looking for?
That's cool. I like it. All right, here's that part, the awkward transition, right? Let's run an ad for chat, for HubSpot's chat. And by the way, Leanne and Al, y'all are more than welcome to correct me on I do my ad.
Well, what we should have done is we should have just had them read the ad.
I thought about it.
Better.
I thought about that actually. I was like, oh, let's just have them do it for us, right? I think we talked the other day, we're going to have Scott's mom come on and we're just going to have her read it every time.
Yeah, she would love that, honestly.
I know she would.
Yeah.
So obviously we want to give a shout out to HubSpot for bringing Scott and I into the HubSpot podcast network. We absolutely appreciate Leanne and AL as they're part of it, and they've given me advice offline. So please check out theirs as well. Truth Lies in Workplace Culture. But for HubSpot, they've started working on their AI side of things, right? They're incorporating ChatGPT, and they've got a conversational bot for the CRM Whiz that really can work on the fly, pull quick reports and data points. It can help you with the prospecting emails, what are best prospecting emails. It can help you draft them. It can help you add notes, contacts into your CRM and find prospects. It can help you run the reports. As I understand it too, I don't know if y'all have used it much, it'll also help you write some blog posts if you need it. So it's pretty cool out there. How does my ad for HubSpot compare to yours, or do you guys have like the pre-recorded thing and you drop it in?
We record as the beginning of the month, and we put some fancy music at the bottom, at the back of it, like the 1960s Batman, with Adam West. Is that kind of music? Is that drop? But I liked how natural yours was. It was really cool.
See, Scott, they're way fancier than us.
Everyone is fancier than us.
Right.
I just want you to dial in Scott's mom and get her on the call so we can see how it compares.
It would be
yeah.
His mom
we'll have to do that, and then I'll send you the recording, and she'll put all of us to shame.
Right. In fact, we should just have her do all of them for HubSpot, Scott. That's what we'll do. We'll have her roll it, and then we'll send it out to everybody in the network to say, Scott Leese's mom has read these ads for the month of May. And, a couple of things too, if you are checking out, I think everybody should be, and if you're not, you're way behind in using AI in your place. But please be sure to check out HubSpot AI at HubSpot.com/artificial-intelligence. HubSpot.com/artificial-intelligence. And I really wish they'd come up with a shorter URL there. I don't know if y'all found one yet, but this is how we do it. And now I'm just trying to hit my 60-second requirement for HubSpot. So in all seriousness, we do appreciate what they're doing for the sales community, sharing knowledge. They have a ton of free resources. There's some stuff in our show notes. They've got some pre-sales tools and marketing tools as well. So go click the link in our show notes for the episode. Coming back to culture, right? What's it like when you start to have those two different cultures, right? I think you hit that number 72, right? Then you start to have, the cliques. It's like all of a sudden it becomes high school, right? At least that's what we call it here. I don't know how it was in the UK, but how as a leader, if I'm a leader of leaders, I'm a CEO, I'm a founder, and I'm growing, how do I allow those different cultures to exist, but, try to not have the sales versus marketing, negative culture and stuff like that? Like, what advice do we give to the higher up executives?
Microcultures aren't necessarily a bad thing.
Right. That's what I'm trying to understand. How do I work them in a healthy way?
Yeah. So long as they're not the complete opposite ends of each other. You know, if you've got one culture where, you know, customer is king and one culture where no one even thinks about customers, then that's going to be a problem and cause tension in your business. I think it comes down to really, there can be a tendency as a business leader to have your vision, have your mission, have your values, put it on a wall, put it on the intranet, put it in your recruitment stuff, and not really spend the time to think about how that translates into every role within the business. So if our value is to be bold, that's behaviors are probably going to look very different in the sales team in terms of business development and outreach than it might do in the finance team. You know, the finance team is working within some you know, regulations and laws here. So what we can do in terms of being bold might be quite different to the approach that a salesperson can take. But actually defining those behaviors, what are the characteristics of it? What's an actual example of how that value looks in action in sales, in marketing, in finance? And what's the mutual value for all of us as different functions to share this value and share these behaviors as an organization, again, towards our mission delivery? There's one thing that is coming out of the research more and more now, is that the people that are entering the workplace, and also beyond that, given I'm sorry, is this a trigger word, pandemic, and the shifts of work that we saw there, people are reevaluating what life means to them, and they want to work to play a part of it, but not all of it. And I think if we can, as leaders, translate these values into individual behaviors across roles within the organization that we want to see, these desired behaviors, then also help each individual role understand how they are individually contributing to mission delivery, then even if we do have these little pockets of microcultures here and there, collectively, we're all on the same page.
Well, you've got that great story, which I don't know whether it's true or not, but about JFK. And you tell it because you tell it much better than I do.
I don't know if it is an urban legend. I mean, you might have heard it. The janitor who went to NASA.
I don't know.
No, go. Yeah.
So President Kennedy visited NASA, came across a janitor and said, "Hello, what's your job here?" And the janitor said, "I'm here to put a man on the moon, Mr. President."
Yes.
I think I have heard that quote before.
Yeah.
And I think the cool thing about that is that, yes, there's going to be probably a microclimate amongst the janitors and cleaning staff at NASA, where is that? Is it Cape Canaveral? I can't remember where it is now. So there's going to be that microclimate, and then there's going to be the boffins and the scientists who are working on massively. But as Leanne says, that core mission, you all know where you're going. You know that you respect each other for the jobs they do and how you contribute towards that mission. It's just one core mission, and yes, you possibly could have different microclimates. I mean, am I talking out of term?
No, spot on.
I just saw you looking at me in the corner of my eye, and I was
impressed.
Like,
"Oh, very good."
I do listen to you.
Know.
I do.
Didn't know.
We didn't even get into what's it like to, be married and do a podcast with somebody, right? Where, like I could sit here for another hour and talk to you guys about, tell me more about this. You travel for 6 months and just do your job and, live that dream. So I would love to. Unfortunately, we're kind of at the end, but we always sort of turn over to you. What questions do you have for us? Give us a question or two.
I have one. And I just spotted it today, and I've not listened to it yet. But you had a lady, I think, called Katie on your podcast recently, talking about sales, executive vice president of sales. Was it Katie McPhee?
Katie McPhee, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. And I've never worked for an organization where there is an executive vice president of sales. Normally, there's like 4 of us in a room with 4 phones. So I'm intrigued. What is a culture like in a slightly larger organization of salespeople?
I couldn't necessarily tell you because I've never worked in a company that had more than about 500 employees.
That's still 496 more than me.
Touche.
I would say that's where company culture really comes into play. There's a lot of big companies where they have the best of intentions, but those individual fiefdoms come through, right? And that's where it becomes political. That's where it's, I've worked with very large organizations where they want to do things around sales, support sales, everything's being done for sales, and it's being controlled by marketing. And that marketing group never talked to a salesperson to say, is that the kind of community you want? What do you like in the community, right? And it's done, and the company, the organization as a whole, 100% supports the effort of what they're doing. They're fully behind it. The CEO's behind it. It's a big initiative. But people's specific KPIs drive them based on what they need to get done, not necessarily what's best. So it can start high in a certain way. Everybody still believes that. They all know they're going to the moon. But then there's this piece where unintentionally they don't do some of the right things. And then when you call them out, they get frustrated and they kind of go, well, whatever. And then if it doesn't work, people are like, well, yeah, we told you. So I think the political stuff happens when it gets up there. It doesn't mean it happens always in a negative way. That's just what I've seen and experienced. I think too that the best leaders go through, I think, the things y'all are talking about. How do I make sure that my culture is there? How do I do that? A good friend of ours used to run sales over at ZipRecruiter, and he built it from 0 literally to 400 salespeople. And one of the pieces of advice he gave me a while back was, even though he managed through managers, he had backdoor conversations with people on the sales team to see what was going on. And he didn't. And I said, well, did you tell the managers you were doing that? He's like, no. And I said, well, what would happen if they found out? He's like, well, if they came and told me, I'd be like, well, that's my job. Like, I'm not doing it to catch you off guard. I got to figure out what's going on. And he was also very good at it. Kevin Gaither, if you don't know him, y'all should talk to him. You should probably have him on your podcast. He was also smart enough to kind of go, oh, if that's what's happening, how do I address that without sort of calling somebody out? A little bit like what y'all are saying of like, how do I take that information and see what can I do to improve things without making it look like somebody tattletaled and it's this one particular team. So I think that's what the best leaders do in that space, at that exec vice president level. I also think the last challenge, and I'll shut up, is if it's, I think you said earlier, if it's not company wide, right? That's a challenge. Like when you see, someone come in and Scott, I know you haven't been in that big company, but I know how you build culture. You build it in such a way that it's great for the sales team, and I know you try to get the rest of the company on board. You try to get them to do not what sales does, but find the right things to motivate their own team. And they just don't do it. And then
that's why I always left.
Yes.
That's why I never got beyond 500 out.
Right. So, and I think that's what I see happen the most at that level. But and tell you to call Katie and have her on and ask her that question, though. Might be the right, for you guys. So
yeah, I'll listen to her episode when I walk the dog tomorrow. That'll be a good one.
Cool. Well, thank you both again for coming on. We appreciate it. We'd certainly come on yours too. We, love it. So everybody, please go check out Truth, Lies, and Workplace Culture with Leanne and AL Elliott. I'm not sure what country they're in at the moment, but they travel and change countries every 6 months. So thank you, everybody. And we will see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Got it.